Hello, everyone. We are so glad that you are here. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see this great slideshow we've got for you. Welcome to our first From the Archives event. My name is Nicole Stammet, and I am Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of English at Agnes College. As the Writers' Festival commemorates its 50th anniversary, we wanted to give everyone a chance to look back at some of the amazing events that have comprised the festival over the years. In commemorating this occasion all week long, we will also be hosting events featuring returning guests, poet Rita Dove, and playwright Jacqueline Goldfinger, class of 2000, Agnes Scott class of 2000. We have a lot of events this week. All upcoming Writers' Festival events can be accessed via calendar.agnescott.edu. And please take a look at Karis Books' virtual book booth, which has information about how to purchase some of the works featured this week. We hope that you will join us again in just a couple of hours when we host a reading from Agnes Scott students who are finalists in this year's Writers' Festival contest at 6:30 p.m. At that time, we will also be launching this year's Writers' Festival magazine. I am delighted to turn things over to your host for this particular event, Dr. James Stammet, who selected this event to share with you today. We'll be featuring the Q&A session of the 2013 Writers' Festival.
Thank you, Nicole. So there are so many great events at the Writers' Festival every year that it might be hard to name a favorite. But if I was to be truthful, the author's Q&A is often my favorite. The ability to hear authors talking about their work, about the life of a writer, what literature means to them, to hear them talking with one another is really amazing. And while there's always a moment of anxiety at Q&As where the audience is waiting, hoping for one brave soul to raise their hand and ask a question, that moment is fun and filled with anticipation too. I should say that at Agnes Scott, that moment doesn't usually last long. At the Q&A we're about to see from 2013, Anna Kabe was the student who ended that moment of tension, asking a question that set the ball rolling and spurred quite a bit of conversation from the authors. Anna is now a respected writer in her own right, by the way, and was invited to last year's Writers' Festival. The Q&A we're about to watch was also the first year that I was teaching at Agnes Scott, and I was teaching Cristina Garcia's novel, The Lady Matador's Hotel, in my English 110 class, a novel I still teach. One of my students from that class asked a question too, early in the event. I remember this student's frequent participation in our class, but I was taken aback by her bravery at this Writers' Festival event. It's not easy to raise your hand and ask a question in a large group, especially when that group contains your peers, friends, teachers, and well-known authors. I don't think I would have been up to the task when I was 18. In fact, I know I wouldn't have been, but this student was. She was learning from the examples of peers like Anna, and she was setting the precedent for those who would follow, entering the fray by joining the discussion about important issues related to writing and literature. The thoughtful questions you'll see are carefully considered and given equally thoughtful answers. But those answers are made all the better when they turn into a conversation with the other authors and sometimes with the audience. Really, the Writers' Festival Q&A is more of a discussion than a question and answer, one that has no script and is directed by those in the room at the time. That's what makes it so fun. I hope you'll think so too. So please now enjoy this Q&A from 2013.
This program is brought to you by Agnes Scott College. For more information about Agnes Scott College, please visit our website at agnescott.edu.
I'm Cristina Garcia, chair of the English department. Welcome, everybody. We're so glad you're all here. I won't delay another second. Our three writers are Angel Rashida Ahmad, Gishen, Cristina Garcia. They're going to take your questions, and I know you have lots of them. Don't be shy. They're going to moderate their own panel. So let's get started.
Okay. So, all three of you are women of color. And
Can everyone hear Anna?
Okay.
A
No?
little louder.
All right, sure. Hello. So, all three of you are women writers of color, and I'm just kind of wondering how you kind of navigate that, especially in the publishing world, and especially the way people tend to label writers from a marginalized group as in certain ways. So, if that makes any sense as a question.
I don't know what she means. Christina. Gish. Take it away.
Yeah, I was going to say, if we really scratch our heads, we come up with something.
All right. Well, you know, that's a reality that we can bump up against, but at some level you have to think about the work that matters to you. And if you're going to stand up for that, and I think that's, for me, that's how I look at it. What matters to me? I can't write about what doesn't matter to me, and you know, I understand what that climate is like, and I always believe there's a way to get, you know, be able to get my work out regardless to that fact. So if I thought about it, I wouldn't write at all. So it's always been like that. That's always been the world I've been in. So I have to go forward anyway with what I choose to do.
I think it's really, you know, we're just saying if I thought about it, I wouldn't write at all. But really, I couldn't agree more. But I also think that, you know, if there's an opportunity in it, you know, it's just kind of like when I think about what I tell my daughter, you know, when she complains, you know, something is the matter with high school, and I say, this is your chance to make a difference, you know. And so there is a way in which it is both a major pain in the neck. It is something that could silence you if you let it, but we try not to. But it's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity to remake the world, you know. And I do think that writers, we're culture making. That's our job. And so where there is something that is the matter, it's our job to, you know, to fix it. And so I do think that, you know, with our imaginations, we can imagine different worlds. I think it's helpful just also to be kind of an example and to write across boundaries, for example. And that's something that I do feel very strongly about. I feel that, you know, if you yourself, you know, I'm Asian American, if I were to only write about people like me, well, I'm sure I would not have so many books out by now, right? So it's very important, you know, to try to understand, you know, the experiences of others, you know, including the internal experiences of others, and to try to represent that, you know, on the page as part of what it means to be, whatever, fill in the blank, right? And so that's to sort of say that there's a way in which we have these labels. Our job is not only to object to the labels, but to redefine them, so that, you know, that this thing, Asian American, you want it, by the time someone has read your book, you want them to feel like they don't really know what that term means exactly anymore. And that's, you know, so we're trying to open things up, which I know you do very much with your work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's about amplifying narrative possibilities on the page and off for yourself and for others, and to go with what you're obsessed with, what gives you pleasure, and in so doing, helping that amplification. You know, I mean, in my case, in the whole Cuban American community, it's been this long shouting match for 50 years.
And it's the same argument back and forth, and yet they're the ones who hold everybody's attention. They're the ones who define it publicly for the rest of us. And so I think it's so important to be trafficking in what's complex, what isn't so easily categorizable, etc. And that, I think that's part of what we all do here in a multitude of ways.
Yeah, but what has been the argument?
Oh, the argument, well, you know, the flip sides of the same argument, but, you know, the pro-revolution, anti-revolution, you know, the kind of the exile sensibility, they're really the same, they're flip sides of the same coin, although they won't recognize it, but it just drowns out everybody else, and then they also purport to speak for the rest of us. And that's the other thing that's a kind of interesting issue maybe, where there's this expectation that you're supposed to represent, you know, everybody, which I think is, first of all, an impossibility, and not really, I don't think really a worthy goal. I think to get one voice in all of its intricacy and complexity and crenellated glory it's already huge.
Here's another way I look at it. I've inherited another sort of distinction, not just an African-American woman. I'm now a woman of disability, and I didn't know much about that until I inherited this. And my experience going around in the world is that people don't really know what it's like. People have curiosity about it, and the way I have to negotiate a world made for sighted people. It requires that I be vocal. It requires that I speak up about the experience, because people need to know, and I feel that what I can contribute, it helps me be visible in a world where I'm generally regarded as being invisible, even though how could you miss a person with a white cane going down the way? So for me, it's really important to write from those perspectives, to have voice. I need to have voice. And although I don't represent everyone with a disability, when I go places, I end up being a poster child, whether I want to or not. I'm keenly aware of that, and anything that I can do to try to eradicate the ignorance that exists, the stereotypes that exist, any of that, I'm more than willing to do. And so in terms of, I mainly write poetry, so in the last few years I've turned more attention to writing about the experience of blindness as a way of, you know, mediating the different worlds.
It's so interesting that you should say this about representation. And you know, it's funny just listening to you. Of course, we're so grateful to you that you do, you know, enlighten us. And yet there's a kind of a tension always between the definition of the artist as it has been defined for us, which is a person who is ultimately completely disinterested. That's the sort of the traditional view. And there is a way in which I think that we've been brought up to feel that to represent anything is to be less than an artist, you know. But I actually feel today that, you know, and I've struggled with that a lot. I've had older female mentors. For instance, I very much remember I was once on, I don't know, the Jim Lehrer show or something. You know, I was on a TV show around the election, and Cynthia Ozick said to me, "You're being a citizen," and that was a bad thing. And you know, and I remember thinking, "Oh my God, I've been a citizen." But then I realized, like, oh, or at least in our generation, I felt like, you know, that was the model that they had of what it meant to be an artist. And that, you know, an artist belonged to some exalted realm, and anything that you did was kind of that in the everyday realm meant that you were less than that, right? Yeah. But I have to say that today I reject that. You know, I mean, we've had examples of other people before us who rejected, I think, starting with Grace Paley in fiction. But she occupied a very, you know, a very contested space because of her activism. And Maxine Hunt Kingston also was a very activist, and there was a way in which the literary world viewed them as tainted somehow. But I have to say today I reject that utterly, and I think that it's one more way in which we have to remake the culture. We have to remake the culture at large, and we need to remake the artistic culture too.
It's also peculiarly, God, that was, you know what I'm saying, peculiarly
It's peculiarly difficult to say.
American too, because
Yes.
it is, because this conversation doesn't happen in the same way in other places. I remember, I don't know, maybe 20 years or so, probably more. I remember going to pretty much a panel like this with writers speaking at the New School. And the two I remember most were Günter Grass, who's a German writer, and I think it was it John Updike was there perhaps as well, and there was this big argument about political engagement and does that disqualify you as an artist or doesn't, and yet people like Günter Grass, people like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, you know, all the Latin Americanists, if they weren't politically engaged, that was even suspect, you know, so, and they all had other jobs, and you know, and writing essays and journalist pieces and whatever, so political engagement is really almost expected of artists in other parts of the globe. Where here there's this big divide, and which I think even still persists into this generation. So it really, I think the ultimate freedom is to do what interests and obsesses you, and if that means going into to some degree into activism or politics, or representing the disabled, or participating in, you know, you were telling me earlier that you had a voice in an award for Asian writing, then yes. I mean, because if we're not there and we're not speaking up, the same old keeps happening.
Yeah.
You know? And we need to be present to disrupt and interrupt and derail the business as usual. I think that's part of our job as well, either on the page or not.
I think when art is integral to your life, it becomes something that you can engage in other realms with it, like you say, in activism. You know, there's the distinction between art for art's sake and living art that, you know, helps you in your everyday. I know that's what that's how I connect with art. There's a utilitarian side to it, what it does for me, how it helps me get through my day to day. And it's hard for me to not see it that way. And so, you know, I reject that notion that you only have to write within this narrow band. It's like language is living and it changes, we change it, and art is living and we change it.
You know, it's so interesting, not to plug my own new book, but it is exactly about this divide, about, you know, art for art's sake versus art that has a kind of use. And I will say that the argument in my book is that the art for art's sake argument is very much tied up with individualism, and the kind of I would say, some people would say, excessive emphasis that we put on art as being simply something that comes from a sacred spark within, is something which is really quite unusual, which is really only finally, it's only finally really dominant in a very small part of the world, meaning Western Europe and America, with America at the pinnacle of this, and that pretty much everywhere, you know, Asia, Latin America, you know, you name it, even Eastern Europe. You know, this is where Günter Grass comes into play. Even Eastern Europe, even the Czech novelists like Milan Kundera, even Orhan Pamuk over there in Turkey. Most people in the world actually kind of have a quarrel with the level of individualism and the view of art that we have here in America. So I don't, you know, it's just, and it's one of the gifts, I think, of our globalized world, though, that we're actually able to have this conversation, which I will say 20 years ago in the art world would have been, in the literary world, would have been a very dangerous conversation to have. I mean, it's really interesting when we think about, we were on a stage 20 years ago together, and I'm trying to think whether we would have had the nerve to say such a thing And in, you know, in front of that, you know, we were in Seattle and
That
Portland
super
together.
liberal,
Yeah, you know,
particular kind of.
I think that had we said
sensibility.
that, I think that we, you know, that we would have become kind of suspect in a way that, you know, it would have been dangerous.
Close to the margins.
Yeah, and that's what have pushed us back out to the margins, you know. But now that we kind of inched our way in, now we can actually bring the news, the real news
Yeah.
of what we have to say, and a real vision of what life can be and what art can be. I think it's a little bit different than what is dominated.
Yeah. Should we take another question?
I was gonna say, you ask a question and get a long answer. Well, she put her finger right. I mean, that's, you know.
Right.
That was a big question, big question.
I have a question for you, Ms. Garcia. I recently read your YA novel, Dreams of Significant Girls, and I wondered if you approach writing for adults and writing for young adults differently, and how those processes are different for you, if indeed they are.
Yeah, they're very different for me. I mean, I don't know, maybe they shouldn't be, but the books for, I did a YA book and a middle school book and actually a picture book as well at one point. And I don't know that I'll do any more because I was sort of following my daughter, you know, writing for her in a way. And I think a couple of things. First, they're very voice-driven in a way that is somewhat different than the other fiction I write, which is language-driven, sometimes voice-driven, but these are all, I almost always write in first person when I'm writing young adult. And in that particular book, there's 3 different voices that alternate. I did something very unusual with that book, and that is, do you all know that computer program, I think it's called Dragon Naturally Speaking, where you can actually talk into it? I use that for those voices, which I have never done. I wouldn't even dream of doing for the you know, the adult books, and because I really just wanted to get that diction, and so I really had to, on the spot, inhabit that voice. It's not that I didn't finesse them and whatever, but so I used that. I used a new technology for that. And then I also had an in-house teenager, my daughter, who was, boy, talk about serious critics. The New York Times is nothing compared to, you know, your own 16-year-old. And so she just kind of kept me honest. She would see the sort of the daily proofs or whatever, and she kept asking, "Where are the boys, Mom?" I'm like, "What boys? You don't need boys in this one." Boys? You want boys? So yeah, and they also come a lot quicker. You know, 6 months, 7 months, as opposed to the, you know, the long, years-long track of writing a novel. Your question? Oh, right here, yes.
Hello. My question is for you also, Ms. Garcia. So, in my English class, we had just recently finished The Lady Mary North Hotel, and I wanted to know where you got the inspiration for your character, Suki.
Okay, for Suki Palacios, yeah. Suki, for those who don't know, the novel is a Japanese-Mexican medical school dropout matador. You know, just your run-of-the-mill character here. And how did I get that? Okay, so I was in Guatemala with my sister about a little over 10 years ago, because she was adopting a baby girl there, and I went to help and facilitate things. And as part of that experience, we were required, and this doesn't sound like much of a hardship, but we were required to stay in this luxury hotel, which I think that the adoption lawyer was getting a kickback for it. And so we were kind of, I think we were, so we were trapped there for 2 weeks, and to me it became this kind of fascinating liminal space where people were coming and going, the adoption, you know, the adoptive parents from around the world, but there was also a military conference going on at this hotel, what kind of a hemispheric conference, so I'd have to fight, you know, in the gym with these, everyone was wearing dark sunglasses, that's all I can say, these wraparound dark sunglasses, all these guys, these goons, and so all this stuff was happening, and I thought, what a fascinating place. You know, so I set myself the task of writing a book that takes place over the course of a week, and I wanted to populate this hotel with lots of different folks. So I did the military guy, I did the adoptive parents, I did people I did see that, but I wanted someone a little bit more kind of dashing, someone for whom everyone could pine over and speculate about and so on. And so I just came up with this crazy matador. I have a thing, and maybe because I'm so tiny myself, but I have a thing for Amazonian women. And I love women, these Amazonian women who transgress into the male space, and there's nothing really as insularly male, I think, than the bullfighting world. So it was extremely tempting, and so, and then I'm also very interested in multiply hyphenated identities and whatever, and so that's how she came to be. It's a long answer, but need a little context, yeah.
My question is for you about Flame Matador's Hotel. Why did you choose not to, say how Suki's bullfighting went in the end of the book? Why did you choose to leave that a mystery? I know a lot of people in my class had.
My apologies, but maybe next edition I'll have to put an appendix or something, or addendum, for the students at Agnes Scott College who protested this ending. Well, how would you have ended it? You wanted to see it? Did you want to see it more fully, or how did your classmates
I think we just wanted to know, because she just got out of the hospital and she's going right back into the rings. I think we just wanted to know, how everything was going to go for her. Because she was so, headstrong, and then the other matador was just, no one liked her.
Right.
Everyone wanted her to lose. So I think we just wanted to know, how the chips would have fallen for her.
Yeah. So you wanted a definitive answer on, does she
Yes.
make it? Does she not make it?
Does she not win?
Too bad. You can torture me with a little chocolate, and I maybe something for you at the last end. But no, anyway, I tend to like ambiguous endings. So I guess it would be.
I know.
Megan?
Okay. Well, this question is also about endings, but it's for everyone. I struggle a lot with finishing, not finishing, but knowing when a story is over. And I like to write short stories, but also longer stories. And I can never quite get it right. It always wants to be a longer story, or it just stops. And I'm wondering, when do you know when a piece of poetry or a fiction is done?
Okay. Yeah, endings can be tough, knowing when. And how do I know? Well, it's hard to say how I know exactly. I don't have a little check sheet I can point out. But it's something about the way it feels. And I have to be willing to have it end, and maybe have it end in a way that I hadn't planned on, is sometimes how I know. My earlier days, my poems, I tell my students, my poems used to be 12 lines long, and someone tried to get me to write longer poems, and when they gave me a bigger book, a bigger sheet of paper, and I was so conditioned to writing the other way that when I would be I noticed that when I would get to line 10 or 11, and that's normally where I was starting to wind up, my stomach would tighten up, because I felt the pressure. I've got to wrap this up, I've got to stop it. And once I was given the bigger sheet of paper and had the challenge of going past the 12 lines, I was totally lost. I didn't know how I could go on past what I thought was the end, except to just keep writing and trust, keep writing. And even if it meant overwriting, then that gave me the challenge of having to go back and read it for its completeness. Where is the beginning? Where is the middle part? Where is this thing going? And when does it seem to be done? Or noticing when it it's starting up again. I used to do that too, in learning how to write past my former limitations. So, and I think that sensibility is still with me. I don't have a sense of how long something's going to be when I'm writing it. I'm just committed to getting everything down that I have when I'm there writing it. And then later I go back and size it up for its completeness or incompleteness. You know, things like that. If I have to have a certain kind of ending, if I have to insist on a certain kind of ending, that can be a problem. So being able to listen and hear the sensibility that the poem is trying to bring forth is where I can find when it's over.
You know, it's so interesting that you should say that about both sort of the way that you work, which is so intuitive, which I think that certainly that's something that I've also had to work past. You know, this feeling that something should be a certain length. And certainly everyone who's ever worked from the short story going to the novel knows exactly that feeling, like, you know, you're 20 pages and it feels like you should be done, and how do you kind of set yourself on a different path so that you can keep on going. But it's so interesting too that you should be so focused so much on sort of the feeling that you have and of surprising yourself and writing something you hadn't planned on. I think that for me, first of all, if I'm writing something, I definitely am very attuned to this feeling of, oh, something is happening that I did not plan on. You know, that's very important. You want to feel like the story has gotten up on its own legs and has walked off. As for when you feel it's gone far enough, you know, I think in the end you want to feel that there's been a sea change. You know, so you could sort of say, well, how has this character changed? You know, that's kind of a tough thing because that's a little too fill in the blank. But I think we all know the feeling, that there's been a sea change, you know, that this person has matured in some way. I think that if you have the feeling that you can say what that is exactly, like you can fill in the blank, you have not gone deep enough. And that, you know, you're not working on this intuitive unconscious level. You're still working with your head. And then you will find that you have trouble with your ending, sure enough, because it's not coming from all the way within. When you have this feeling that this thing is on its own program, that you are just kind of trotting along after it, I think you frequently have a feeling both that you're not in control and that, you know, it's not so smart. You're not learning from the smart part of you. You're learning from some other part. Then frequently you will find that it's just that you're just, there's almost like a different vista. It's like you see a different set of things. But it shouldn't be something where you can fill in the blank. This character, you know, like this high school English papers, you know, this character has learned that his best friend is a skunk, right? Like that's not a story. I mean, maybe they have learned that, but you know, but you know, a real story is a lot more than he figured out that his best friend is a skunk, or you know, this guy, you know, that boyfriend was no good. That boyfriend is not good. That's about the boyfriend, right? It's about the boyfriend. It's not about, you know. So, but like I say, this feeling that, you know, I think you can almost feel it's feeling like that something has turned, so that you see, you know what I mean. So everything that the character sees is now different. When you have that feeling, then you're done. I will say too that, you know, that in terms of where the last line should be, I actually noticed this in looking at a lot of the stories that were in the magazine, which were wonderful. But I did notice they tended to land a little bit hard. And that Updike used to say that you should feel at the end of a story that a door has opened. See, this is what I'm going at, the different vista thing. You should feel that a door has, not that we are now set, now we know something. It's not that. It's now a new door has opened, and then you're done.
Yeah, I like that notion of just something ending with possibilities, a little ambiguity. I'm being self-defensive after the reading manager thing. But also, I think the beginnings of stories are clues too. We've talked a lot in this workshop I've been doing about openings as to what's kind of being promised in a way. You know, we talked about how in kind of every opening where you're making a contract with the reader to some extent, and that the ending in some way, I think, in the best endings reverberate back in an unexpected way toward that opening. It's not definitive, it doesn't come with a hard answer necessarily, but I think it evokes organically and I forget who was it that said the best endings are both surprising and inevitable. Was that Aristotle? But there is that. There's a sense of once you read a good ending, you feel like it couldn't have happened any other way, and yet you're surprised at the same time. It's not predictable. So those are some of the elements of a good ending. But and that's not to say there is only one good ending, but maybe it's something you need to try on a few things and then think as much about the beginning at the end as you do the end at the end.
I think those considerations apply to poetry too.
Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you.
Everybody go down.
There was a hand up over there.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Garcia, you were just touching upon this, but this is still a question for all three of you. How much does reader satisfaction play into your endings?
Reader satisfaction? Clearly not enough. Two on tap. Also, mostly we don't know about the readers. If I hadn't been sitting here, how would I have known that a rebellion was underfoot? English whatever, what was the class?
English 110.
English 110. They were ready to they were ready to string me up. I wouldn't have known. That's part of the sweet ignorance of writing in your cave and not really knowing what people think, except a few grumbling critics. But
The question is, when you know something like that, do you actually reconsider? And that's a very tough question. But I had a kind of a similar situation where at the end of my first book, I ended in quite an enigmatic way, very ambiguous. And also, very unfortunately, it just so happened that the way it was set, the last line just happened in paperback, ended on at the last line of the book, so there was no there was no white space underneath it, and it just so happens that the last page of kind of that folio, so they couldn't have any additional pages after it. And the result was that the number of times I got stopped in airports where people said, "There's something the matter with my book." I mean, it's just everyone was like, "There's something the matter with my book. I don't have the end." I'm like, "Well, no, that actually was the end." I finally had to have the publisher put a little black box at the end, or the last word, and then there's a box. I wanted this with the end, but I guess there wasn't room to say the end, But the question is kind of is today, knowing what I know, and I know that you are not going to change a word of your book. But knowing what I know today, I have to say that with so many people hadn't come up to me, probably I would add another line. And I can say that, I mean, it's kind of a version of workshop, right? Kind of well, when do you listen? Think people didn't like your story. Well, when do you pay attention to that, and when do you not? And frequently, when I'm teaching, I frequently will just have a show of hands. Well, how many people were confused? And if 3/4 of the room, 3/4 of the readers, the hand goes up, I think it's a sign that maybe, it's about art, it's about this book within. But perhaps you need to think again.
Clarify a little bit.
And I think in my case, where so many people came up to me and were so passionate and so upset, that if I had it to do over, probably I would just add that extra line.
Have you figured out what line?
No, I haven't gotten that far. Now that we have to reset the whole damn book. I mean, I can only imagine going to my editor and saying, "Oh, I wanted to add one line to my book." I don't think that's going to fly. But it is like I say, it is kind of a larger question of at one point well, how much of the writing how much is it for you, and how much is it finally about communication, and finally to me, Cristina, your book is perfect, okay, but in my own case, you know, I think in my own case, I feel that it was distracting. You know what I mean? It was clearly distracting to these readers that they felt that there was something the matter with the book and so on and so forth. And, you know, if you would ask me when I was writing, did I want them to all feel that, you know, frustrated and like there was something the matter with their book and they wanted their money back? That's not what I wanted them to, you know. I don't want them, you know, writing to the publisher. That is absolutely not what you know what I mean? I wanted
It's distracting.
It's distracting. It made them sort of unable to deal with what I would want them to deal
Yeah.
with. And so therefore, in the same way I had said, if a student came to me and that, you know, all these people were all kind of trying to figure something out, I would say, why don't you just give it to the reader so that they can concentrate on what they should be concentrating
Yeah.
on.
I
is
think
what I would say.
that brings
So
up
it's
a
not
very
like-
good point
it's not
about
just
serious.
pleasing. It's not
Yeah.
just pleasing the reader, as it is just having them get kind of, you know, kind of the fullest experience.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think what's very helpful, probably the most helpful thing in, say, workshops, is to find one or two other writers, other peers who share your sensibilities, whose sensibilities you trust, to exchange work, because, you know, there comes a point too, you can get a little loony, you're in these worlds by yourself for long stretches of time, and you can lose sight sometimes. But if you have a couple of good readers, and that doesn't mean you're writing by consensus or you're going to do everything they say or whatever, but just to get a little feedback, I think is helpful. I had a similar situation with my first book, Dreaming in Cuban, where it ends, you know, in this vague way where the one of the women just sort of walks into the sea. You don't know if she's committing suicide, if she's going to hitchhike with the Coast Guard, you know, what's going to happen. People were frustrated with that as well. But there's also, I think mixed, and maybe you're being too hard on yourself, but there's also, I think, probably mixed with a little longing that they wanted it to continue longer.
True.
You know, they don't want, like all of us, when we read a good book, we're sad when it ends. There's this bittersweet feeling, you know, whether we're very dissatisfied with it or not, but, you know, could it have gone on longer, or is there going to be a sequel or whatever, you know?
Yeah.
So,
That's true. I will say that this goes back to the question about endings that Megan asked, and that you know, my editor at Knopf has said to me that in her experience that all literary writers tend to underwrite a little bit at the end. That we have a horror of being obvious, and that this is, she says she has noticed this with many literary writers, that we tend to not want to say too much, and that she has over the years learned to push. I mean, and she's Alice Munro's editor, so, you know, I mean, she pushes the best, but even Alice Munro, I mean, she pushes Alice for one last little bit. She was not the editor of my first book. And it is interesting to me that, you know, in none of my subsequent books has this happened. Do I actually have this conversation with her, or do I just know I'm going to have this conversation with her, and therefore I write just a little bit just a little bit more. But it is interesting that I think that it seems to be a more general phenomenon.
good question?
I do have a question. What would you say the ratio is with how conscious you are and your subconscious when you're writing? Because I struggle with that, because I don't want to write down the page, so to speak, so it's predictable. So I let my subconscious, you know, flow into random pieces of language that I have, like in my, you know, million files or whatever. So how much of a plan would you say, and how much do you stick to it when you're writing?
You know, it's so interesting because it's a very difficult question to answer, and probably every person has a different approach, actually, you know. But I remember, especially because I came out of the short story to the novel, and because my short stories had always been written in this very intuitive way. I was therefore writing my novel the same way, and I remember when I was writing my first novel, you know, pretty much every week I would go to some reading with some writer, some famous writer, be up there, and people would ask them about, I would ask some version of your question, and the person would say something like, well, with a novel, I think it's good to have a plan. I don't have a plan. In the end, that worked for me, but the answer is, some people feel that they need a plan so that they can, if only to relax, and then they can abandon their plan, I think everyone is always prepared to abandon the plan, but some people feel like they need to have a plan. And I think many people take the approach of using a lot of very loose, a lot of letting the subconscious go on the early drafts, with the understanding or thought that they will come back to it and they will structure and and bring order to the mess. When I was in graduate school, this was called the barf and polish approach. But to this day, I think that there's a lot to be said for barf and polish. And I think that, not everybody is like that, but for many people, that really is a great approach. And then if you know that you're going to polish later, those early drafts, loose. Just let it go. See, make a big mess. You know what I mean? You're just making a big mess. Don't worry about it. Just see what's there.
Yeah, I definitely subscribe to the B&P approach.
But not everybody does.
No,
And
not
some people,
everybody does,
the whole novel, they go through carefully and they never rewrite one line.
I don't know anybody like that, if they tell you that whatsoever. But no, but sometimes, there comes a point you can't ignore your analytical faculties entirely, but just to trust that you will bring them to bear on this work at, at many, many points, especially once you get that big mess and you have to start thinking about structure, scaffolding, and it's just an ongoing dialogue. It's an ongoing process. It's not something that you get it in 2 or 3 drafts. You're always negotiating these things. And one of the things that I've encouraged my students to do here is to read poetry regularly. Just to sort of be thinking imagistically, especially in those early drafts, and to not have any preordained conclusions about one's work. To keep it as free as possible, and to invite the mystery and invite some chaos, and let it wreak a little havoc on the work and see what it illuminates along the way.
Yeah, because sometimes in the beginning, I know I can't always recognize what I'm looking at. Mm-hmm. So I don't want to come in too soon to impose too much order on it right away. Mm-hmm. I'll use whatever shows up, and if it makes sense, I'll keep it. I had a workshop once with Robert Haas, and when I was a graduate student, and he let us ask a lot of questions. He was interested in what we wanted to know, and somebody asked the question, what do you do about that voice you can't turn off? And he said something to us that made the whole room go, and he said, just write it down, it wants to be loved. And we said, what? So he gave us an assignment, and so, you can't sit down in New York unless you have money. Every place, you have to spend some money to get a place to sit down. So I went back to my apartment because it was set up for work, and I'd had a nightmare that night before. And I would look out at the world, and the nightmare would superimpose over whatever I was looking at. So I started writing, and that became the content of what I was writing. And as I was going on, that voice that he talked about, that critical voice kicked in. And I remember he said to write it down. I wrote it down, and then it got quiet, and the poem started back up. And that's how I got the thing written back down, going down the page, back and forth. To my surprise, when I finished, it turned out to serve as a great counterpoint to the main voice in the poem, and I didn't take it out. And so, a lot of things can come out, but we don't always know. Sometimes the way I write changes, and I often hear what I'm writing. Well, now I absolutely have to hear what I'm writing. I can't see it. But often it comes to me as some kind of sound, and I have to differentiate what the sound is and what word it is and that sort of thing. So if I discount it too soon, I throw away something that's trying to emerge that's new and different.
Do you feel that, do you feel that your writing is How different is it to hear the words instead of like seeing them?
Well, I don't know if I can answer it, I'm so accustomed to it. There's something beautiful about seeing the shape of a poem on the page, for instance. It informs something about the sensibility of the poem, the way it's laid out. And so, not seeing that, I missed that aspect. That was part of how I understood a poem, the way it was sprayed out on the page, the space, the white space it used or didn't use. So as I'm working on pieces, I understand that a line needs a certain kind of spacing. And in my imaginary writing world, I try to give it that. But it means I have to remember the schema that the poem is taking on, so that if I make any subsequent spatial things, spatial layout changes, it has to be in relationship to what has come before. So it's a little more complicated. I've used that white space far more liberally as a sighted person than I do now. I rely on it far less. And I think about, what do these poems look like? Do they just look like bread boxes here on the page? But I have a sensibility about a line that it needs a certain kind of shape. When I pick that up, I follow it up. And I have to remember that it's set that way. I use software. Cristina talked about the dragon, where you talk to it and then it writes. And I have software that as I write, it speaks what I'm writing. So I have all different kinds of features with the software I can turn off and on. I don't do it while I'm writing, it's too complicated. So after I've written it out, I can go and listen for where the spacings are, what kind of margins and indentations that are there, in case I don't remember exactly how I set it up, give me some indication. So technology can be really helpful.
Time for one more question.
She had her hand up from the very beginning.
So,
Maybe two.
Okay, since you're all pretty much, as Anna said, women of color, obviously I'm not. I'm a white Polish girl, but
We won't hold that against you.
I love Korea, and I want to make Korea my home one day, but I fear inside of myself this idea of I don't think I'm allowed to, because it's not mine. And when I hear what you guys write about and read a little bit of what you guys write about, it's very much somewhat encompasses where you're from, your experiences, but with me, it's, I don't want to write about Alabama. I'm trying to get as far away from that place as I can. But I love Korea, but, when I talk to people about Korea who aren't Korean, they think I'm just fabulous. They're just like, how do you know all this? But when I talk to Koreans, I see this little hesitation in their eyes, like, who's this creepy girl? Like, sometimes I get good responses, and sometimes I get, why are you imposing on my culture? And I guess my question is, I'm not really sure what my question is, but would you personally, all three of you, be offended if you did read someone who isn't from your culture writing about your culture? If that makes sense.
Of course not. Of course, it would be wonderful.
Oh,
It would be wonderful. Although let me say that Alabama is actually very interesting. So I wouldn't, but no, of course the whole idea, to write across boundaries is a wonderful thing, And I wrote a book about a Chinese American turning Jewish. She turns Jewish, she stays Jewish. And I will say, that's just a little example. Maybe it's not as big a boundary as what you're talking about crossing, but I did cross it, just imaginatively, and the result was in my life that I was always asked after that, what I was doing for the high holy days. And I'm just sort of, but people accepted me, everyone thinks I'm Jewish, then I can remind them I'm Catholic. But I think it's great. But I have to say that what you can do imaginatively Korea is a very different place in America. And, we do live in the land of self-invention. And the idea of self-invention is an idea which is big in some other places in the world and not so big in others. And, so that if you were actually to move there and you were to find that, people rejected this idea that you could self-invent as a Korean, I mean, that's just a reality.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not to say that you can't write it, and maybe you can even be it. It's. But I wouldn't want to downplay this feeling that you have. If you feel like people are looking at you cross-eyed. But you may also find that if you write the book, like if I had said, okay, I'm Jewish, I don't know, maybe people would have rejected that, But once they read the book, it's so real that then you become Jewish because they've read the book. Do you know what I mean? So it may well be that you're going to write this book about Korea that's going to be so Korean that people are going to feel that you are Korean, and then when they meet you, it's going to be, but of course you're Korean,
That'd be
And that
awesome.
should be I will say that, in terms of writing across boundaries, that should be your goal. I mean, in other words, like I do think that, yes, you can call it, but, can you just write anything about some other group without ever
I
doing
think it comes with
research?
responsibilities
Yes.
too, I think. That's
Absolutely.
the other point.
Absolutely. A word that we used to not like that word in the literary world.
But I think
right?
it's absolutely true. I
Yes.
mean, I wrote a book actually about the 19th century Chinese farmer
I
who
remember
goes to
that.
Cuba, and I had to kind of get inside his bloodstream and learn a tremendous amount about that era and this particular man and so on. And so you also have to do your homework. I think it's great to write across boundaries. I think we all do it. I've written about Iranian characters and all kinds of characters, but it behooves us also to do it justice. It's not just a question of trampling in and not knowing what we're doing, unless it's one of those books about Americans abroad that Henry James loved. That's a different kind of book, but if you're purporting to be an expert on it in an area, then become the expert. That's part of the research. That's part of what will make this book believable, down to the smallest detail. I remember I showed that same book, because there are swaths of it that took place in Vietnam as well, and I gave it to actually a student of mine, a young Vietnamese student, and there was just one. It seems like a very disposable scene, but there was salt on a table where there wouldn't have been salt in a shaker on a table in Vietnam. And she said, oh, no, first of all, we don't use salt, but if ever we were, it would be in a little bowl. It would be in a little tiny dish. And so it's down to that detail that you have to get right to persuade us, that you have earned this in a way.
That's right. You have to earn it.
You have to earn it.
That's exactly right. And I think that this is where, it's like, you do want to write it in such a way that, maybe not every Korean, but many Koreans would say, yes, I recognize this world. And like you, I wrote, about the Cambodians.
Yes.
And a very similar thing with spices and what they would be doing with the spice, they'd be using a mortar and pestle, these kinds of things. And the Buddhism, but all the detail. But you want to write it until they write to you and they say, someone came to me and said, I had to come and tell you in person. That was incredible, but that was our experience. That's exactly it. That is my family. That is what happened. That is what it's like. And you want to write it until they come to you and they say, that's right, you got it right.
Yeah.
And then you can, and this goes back to the question though of the class and when you look at your readership. I think that when you know that you were writing way out of your own experience, then you do have to pay a lot of attention to those hands in the air. Do you know what I mean? Like what do they say? If you have 75% of the class from, your readers, your Korean readers saying, that's not Korean, then you're not done yet,
And yet, you're in an interesting position as an outsider to refract a lot of what you see in fresh ways that may be, of interest to Koreans themselves. That's you're in between cultures in a fascinating way, and I think that's a very privileged place to be. And on that note, are we?
Thank you so much. It was wonderful. We can ask questions afterwards. Thank you so much. The next event is 4 p.m. in the winter.
Thank you everyone for being here. As you saw, that event is on iTunes along with some of the other events from that year's festival and actually other festivals past. So if you are in the mood for more Cristina Garcia or Angel Rashida Ahmad or Gish Jen, I hope that you will check it out. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you in an hour when we listen to this year's Writers Festival contest finalists from Agnes Scott.